This is EWI Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In Minnesota, the student population is becoming more diverse, but the teacher workforce isn't keeping pace. That's a problem for local schools, according to a news story by today's guests. Faiza Mahamud covers education for the Star Tribune, and MaryJo Webster is the paper's data editor. They're both with us now. Faiza, welcome to EWI Radio.
Thank you, Emily.
And MaryJo, we're delighted to have you back.
Thank you so much.
Faiza, I want to begin with you. Why did you want to tell this particular story?
I initially wanted to tell the story because a lot of parents and a lot of teachers, a lot of advocates were interested in the topic. And as a mother of a 4-year-old, when my son started school in September, I started to experience a lot of these conversations with my son. So the interest was both personal and professional for me.
What did you notice when you took your son to school for the first time?
When I took my son to school the first time, we were obviously very excited, but it didn't hit me until I started doing research on this topic. And I realized that I started testing things with my own experiences. But he's doing well in school right now.
Let's give our listeners an understanding of what Minnesota's public schools look like right now. What are some of the ethnic groups that are represented among the students?
A lot of the students in public schools here in Minnesota are starting to become very diverse. So it's becoming more of a minority-majority. African Americans, Somalis, Latino, American Indians, and biracial cultures are in the classrooms.
And what about the teacher workforce?
A lot of the teachers here in Minnesota and obviously around the country are mostly white. Here in Minnesota, teachers of color make up only 5% of part-time and full-time teachers.
Why is Minnesota having such a tough time recruiting teachers of color?
Researchers shown that there's few minorities who are graduating with teaching degrees, so the schools are competing for a small pool of candidates of color.
Are there challenges related to this that are specific to Minnesota versus things that might be common across the country?
A lot of the teachers have expressed that they were experiencing negative treatment in the schools from their white colleagues, and they talked about how public schools were starting to become this environment that was not a better place for them, which often contributed to minority teachers leaving the profession altogether.
Well, MaryJo, let's turn to you for a moment and talk about the data. What's some of the top line here that we should be paying attention to?
Well, our student population is growing exponentially, especially in the Twin Cities. If you look at the whole state of Minnesota, though, more than a third of students are people of color. And as Faiza said, only about 5% of teachers are. And when you put that on a line chart, the student line is going up, 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 up over time, while the teacher line has been flat. And we see some schools that are doing better. They tended to be immersion schools or those that really cater to a certain demographic of students. But your traditional neighborhood school, the traditional suburban school, seems to be filled with white, largely female teachers and a growing population of minority students.
How difficult was it to get this data?
Not difficult at all. We are immensely lucky in that Minnesota's Department of Education has a data portal where they publish more than we even care about. And whenever we do go to them and ask for something additional, they are super helpful and turn things around quickly. So we are very lucky. I would assume that this data should be available in other states because it's summarized data. So it's not about each individual student. So each row of information is summarized information about an entire school. And there's actually 2 data sets that we got. One is the demographics on the students, and one is the demographics on the teachers. And we put them together. They didn't come together. So on the students, they break down how many students are white, Asian, Hispanic, Black. They have certain buckets that they use here in Minnesota. And then they did the same buckets for teachers. However, they used FTE, full-time equivalency numbers. So it would say something like there's 30.5 6 teachers in this school, and 1.5 of them are Black and 6.2 are Asian or something like that. That's how they would break it down. We had hoped to get more of a head count data, like just how many people are we talking about, regardless of how many hours a week they work. But we couldn't get that fast enough to turn around this story. So we just went with the FTE numbers.
Faiza, did anything surprise you in the numbers as you started putting these pieces together?
The numbers did not surprise me as much because we have always known for many years that the percentage of students of color was growing. And right now we're at 34%. And we have always known that the number of teachers of color has remained stagnant or jumped between 3% to 5%. The one thing that really surprised me, I have to say, is when I was doing the research and trying to merge the two populations of teachers and student data, seeing the gap that existed and seeing that students of color, majority of them in the school systems did not have access to a teacher who really looked like them or even understood their experiences.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment. What does the research tell us about why having that kind of an experience, seeing a teacher who looks like you, matters so much to students?
A lot of the research I looked at, and I have to say I've looked at more than 10 literature reviews, and many of them pointed to teachers of color being culturally well-positioned to eliminate racial disparities in school discipline, and even over time maybe help close the achievement gap. The other thing that also was backed by other researchers was that when students see a teacher who looks like them, they tend to improve their perceptions of school and more likely to graduate from high school or even attend college.
We're talking with Faiza Mahamud and MaryJo Webster of the Star Tribune about their reporting on a lack of teacher diversity in Minnesota's public schools. Don't miss an episode of EWI Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback will help us grow. This week's episode of EWI Radio is sponsored by the Eli and Edith Broad Foundation. The Broad Foundation believes in the power of public education, the potential of students, and the possibilities created by expanding learning opportunities for all children. Visit broadfoundation.org for more information. EWA retains all editorial control over programming and content. Faiza, you've talked with families, you talked with students. What did they tell you they're looking for when it comes to teachers?
I'll start with the students first. One student who's mentioned in my story, Najma, she's a Somali American, and her story struck me, and it was very compelling because she talked about how when she started preschool, the minute she started public schools, she was put in English language learners classes, even though she did not need it. And one thing she told me was that probably if I had a teacher of color, they would understand that I did not need those classes. So what students of color are hungry for, teachers who can understand their experiences, their culture, their religion, and a good listener, parent figure, someone who can push them and just be a role model.
What about on the family's side? What are they looking for?
For the families I have spoken with, Hispanic and African Americans, Somalis, they talked about having a teacher who can understand them as a parent, knowing that they had other priorities and that they were working these longer shifts and did not have access to resources that they could understand. So they just wanted a teacher who could understand their experiences as well and help push their kids to be successful.
You reported on an effort by Minnesota education officials to try and bring more teachers of color in by changing the licensing requirements. Explain that.
Yes. One of the tiered licensing, one that I talked about in the story is a tier 3 teachers. And what that means is a teacher who has gone through the teacher preparation classes and is teaching in the classroom. What they have done is that they have eliminated the standardized test, which is a college level reading, writing, and math. And a lot of the advocacy groups and the statewide teachers union said that those tests are discriminatory. And one of the surveys or the research they've done is that a lot of teacher candidates of color don't do well in those tests because they were set in a way to block them from entering the field.
But there was some pushback to that proposal, wasn't there? On what grounds?
The pushback came from some teachers who felt like if this was eliminated, then they could be viewed as less qualified as their white peers.
MaryJo, I want to turn back to you. You crunch a lot of numbers for the paper. Were there any surprises in here for you, or did you learn anything from this story?
Yeah, we stumbled upon a surprise that we didn't really like. When we first paired the student data to the teacher data and compared, we generated what's called a ratio of students to teachers. And then we looked at how has the percentage of teachers of color changed at these schools over time. And almost all of the St. Paul schools came to the top of the list for the entire state, as we're sorting it by the percentage, the change over time. And it appeared as if all of the St. Paul schools had gone from having hardly any teachers of color to now almost all of their teachers were teachers of color. And at first we were kind of like, wow, they're doing great. They must be doing something right. And at that point, that should have been a red flag for us that something was wrong. But we've also heard that St. Paul pays very well, better than other districts. And we thought, oh, maybe they are, they found the formula. And so Faiza went out to interview teachers at one of these schools. And she was interviewing one of the teachers and asking her, well, why is your school done so well at getting teachers of color? And the teacher just looked at her like, well, I'm only one of three. Why? So we went back and looked at the data, and we had used data from 2017-18 school year. And so I looked back 1 year further and compared the 2 years. And it turns out it looked like what they had done is put all of the white teachers in the American Indian bucket. It was just so obvious that the numbers had just been shifted into the wrong column, basically. And it made it look like there was all these minority teachers, and there really weren't.
Well, that's a pretty good lesson for following up.
Yes, it is. And whenever you're doing data, probably the number one rule is when you find something that seems too good to be true or seems kind of out there, just kind of raises your eyebrow in any sort of way, you got to dig into it because there might be something wrong with the data, or you might have done something wrong in your analysis. I hate to scare people like that, but it's just true. You have to look at it carefully.
Faiza, one challenge for education reporters is talking to students and families. You seem to have a little bit of a knack for it. What advice do you have for reporters about connecting with those two groups when it comes to digging into these kinds of stories?
It takes a lot of work to build trust. So one thing I did when doing this story is that I did not go out and do this reporting in 2 days. I started building relationship 2-3 months before I started taking a crack at this. When you're working on other stories or when you're not on a deadline, just connecting with people and being clear about what kind of story you want to tell. And I think honesty is the number one thing, and encouraging them to participate in these kinds of stories.
Faiza, I did want to mention that you are part of EWI's New to the Beat program for reporters who are relatively new to the profession. So what do you know now that you didn't know last year?
I look at my beat and all the resources that's on the EWI website, and I feel really bad for other people who cover other beats that don't have the same resources that I do. And I'm like, oh my goodness, if only I had this amount of resources when I was covering immigration or city government. But being a part of the EWA team has been amazing. And I think it has really prepared me to tackle this issue. I initially got this story idea from attending one of the EWA conferences. I gathered a lot of story ideas out of that conference, but this is the one that I settled on, just relying on my experiences with my son and people's interest in this issue and the stories we have written about the achievement gaps and school segregation. And with my mentor that was provided to me by the EWA, I was well prepared to tackle this issue.
Well, we're very proud to call you one of this year's rookies. Faiza Mahamud covers K-12 education for the Star Tribune, and MaryJo Webster is the paper's data editor. They both joined us from their office in Minneapolis. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that closes out another episode for us. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line. We're at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week. We'll see you soon. And thank you for listening.